At 67 years old, Robert Miller had spent nearly half his life behind bars, branded a thief, a liar, and a disgrace to his family. Yet the cruelest twist of fate was that the man who put him there was none other than his only son, David Miller. 25 years earlier, Robert had been a respected construction foreman in Ohio, the kind of man who built homes brick by brick and never cut corners. He sacrificed meals, overtime, and every spare dollar so his son could have an education and a better life. But David repaid him with betrayal of the worst kind, when over $1.5 million vanished from the company where they both worked. David forged Robert's signature, planted cash beneath his father's floorboards, and wept in front of a judge, insisting his own dad had stolen everything. The jury believed the ambitious son with the college degree over the father with calloused hands and a sixth-grade education. That day, Robert was sentenced to 25 years in prison while David walked free living in Robert's home, spending Robert's money and erasing his father's honor. But injustice has a way of leaving cracks. Enter Michael, David's teenage son, curious about the grandfather he'd never met. Mrs. Carter, the retired neighbor who never forgot what she saw that night, and Richard Lawson, a dying accountant holding secrets too heavy for the grave. With the help of attorney Charles Bennett and Judge William Harper, Robert's long buried truth was about to claw its way back to the surface. For 25 long years, Robert Miller woke up each morning to the same steel bars and concrete walls, carrying the shame of being branded a criminal. Yet deep inside, he knew the truth that it was his son, David, who had stolen not only the company's money, but also his father's good name. While Robert endured prison, David enjoyed the very life his father had sacrificed to give him. He lived in Robert's home, spent his money, and convinced the world that the old man was nothing but a crook. But life has a way of turning over buried stones. One gray morning, Robert received a letter that shook him to his core. It wasn't from the courts or from an old friend. It was from David. Inside those pages was the revelation of a grandson, Michael, now 15 years old, who had never been told the full truth about his grandfather. David had fed the boy a watered-down story, claiming Robert had made a small mistake and ended up in prison. But Michael was curious, restless, and persistent. He wanted answers, and for the first time in decades, Robert felt a glimmer of hope flicker inside his chest. That spark grew when Michael began writing to him. The boy's words were sharp, thoughtful, filled with the kind of questions only a teenager brave enough or perhaps stubborn enough would dare to ask. He wanted to know about the family history, about the home Robert had once built brick by brick, and about the night everything fell apart. In those letters, Robert saw more than curiosity. He saw the same fire that once burned in his late wife's eyes, the same sense of justice she carried to her last breath. As the letters continued, something remarkable happened. Michael began digging deeper. For a school project, he tracked down people from the old neighborhood. One of them, Mrs. Carter, remembered clearly the night before Robert's arrest. She recalled seeing David walk into the Miller home with a heavy suitcase he guarded fiercely. To her, it had seemed strange at the time, but not enough to question. Now, decades later, that memory painted a different picture, one that matched Robert's truth. At the same time, an unexpected ally appeared. Richard Lawson, the company's former accountant, old, frail, and facing the end of his life. Lawson confessed he had seen irregularities in the books long before the so-called big theft. Small amounts missing here and there, money moved into accounts that didn't belong to Robert. Trail led straight back to David and his accomplice, Thomas Whitman, the powerful son of the company's owner. Lawson admitted he had stayed silent back then out of fear of losing his job. But with his health failing, he no longer wanted to take the secret to his grave. For Robert, these pieces of truth felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. Yet they also brought new fear, because if Michael could uncover this much as a curious teenager, how long before David realized his own son was prying into the past? And what would David do once he felt the walls closing in? Sure enough, tension rose. In one of Michael's letters, he wrote that his father had grown nervous and short-tempered whenever the subject of the past came up. David dismissed Mrs. Carter's testimony as the confused rambling of an old woman. He insisted Lawson was long dead, even though Michael had proof otherwise. The cracks in David's story were widening. Michael was smart enough to notice. Robert read those words with a mix of pride and dread. Pride, because his grandson was relentless, unwilling to accept half-truths. Dread, because Robert knew David better than anyone. When cornered, his son would not hesitate to lash out. The turning point came when Michael mentioned finding an old plane ticket tucked away in one of his father's boxes, dated just after the theft in David's own name for a flight out of the country. It was the kind of detail no rumor or half-truths could erase. For Robert, it confirmed what he had always known. And for Michael, it was the beginning of a dangerous road, because exposing lies is never without risk. And for the first time, Robert realized his grandson's search for the truth might put the boy in the very same danger that had cost him his freedom all those years ago. When the truth starts to stir after being buried for decades, it rarely comes gently. For Robert Miller, each new piece of evidence felt like both a gift and a burden. It gave him hope that justice might finally be within reach. But it also placed his grandson Michael in the crosshairs of a dangerous secret. Michael wasn't content with letters alone. The boy wanted to meet his grandfather face to face. And with the help of Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who had never forgotten that night, he began the paperwork to visit the prison. Robert could hardly believe it when a guard told him that his grandson had been approved to see him. After 25 years of silence and betrayal, the thought of looking into the eyes of family again made his knees weak. That Saturday morning, Robert was led into the visiting room. His heart pounded harder than it ever had during his sentencing. And then he saw him tall, thin, with the same strong jawline Robert saw in the mirror every morning. Michael stood beside Mrs. Carter, hesitant at first. Then suddenly he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around the old man. For Robert, the embrace was like stepping into sunlight after a quarter-century underground. "Grandpa," the boy whispered. Just one word, but it shattered the prison walls around Robert's heart. They sat at a cold metal table, yet the conversation burned with warmth. Michael leaned in, speaking with the urgency of youth. He shared what he had uncovered: the suitcase his father carried, the plane ticket, the unexplained bank deposits. Each detail struck Robert like a hammer blow, confirming what he had known all along, but never been able to prove. Mrs. Carter added her voice, steady and sure despite the years. "I remember that night, Robert. David had that suitcase. He guarded it like treasure. I should have spoken up back then, but I was scared. I'm not scared anymore." Robert clasped her hand, gratitude written all over his weathered face. It wasn't just her memory that mattered. It was her courage to stand by it now, when it might finally make a difference. But then came a twist Robert hadn't expected. Michael reached into his jacket and slipped a folded piece of paper under the table. Robert opened it with trembling hands. It was a receipt dated the day after the theft for a one-way ticket to Panama. It's purchased in David Miller's name. Robert's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just memory or suspicion. This was evidence, proof that his son had been ready to flee and only stayed because his father took the fall. As Robert stared at the paper, he felt a mix of vindication and sorrow. For 25 years he had prayed for the truth to surface, but he had never imagined it would come through the determination of a grandson he didn't even know existed. And yet, beneath the pride in Michael's courage, there was fear. The more the boy uncovered, the greater the risk he faced. Robert knew David better than anyone. A man who had betrayed his own father for money would not hesitate to lash out again if cornered. The visit ended too soon, as all visits in prison do. But before he left, Michael looked Robert in the eye and said, "I'm not stopping, Grandpa. You don't deserve to be here. I'm going to help prove it." Robert wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away before things turned dangerous. But the words caught in his throat. Because deep down, he knew Michael's determination was the very thing that might finally bring the truth into the light. As the boy walked out of the room, Robert whispered a silent prayer, not for his own freedom, but for his grandson's safety. He had already lost one son to greed and betrayal. He could not bear to lose another generation to the same darkness. That night in his cell, Robert picked up a pen and began to write. Not to David this time, but to Michael. He wanted to give the boy guidance, to tell him where to look, who might still remember the truth. He even mentioned Richard Lawson, the old accountant now on his deathbed. His testimony could be the key to reopening the case. For the first time in 25 years, Robert felt something stronger than despair, felt purpose, the fight. For justice was no longer his alone, it belonged to Michael too. And together they might just have the strength to finish what Robert had been denied for so long. Michael's first visit left Robert Miller both uplifted and uneasy. For the first time in 25 years, he felt the warmth of family again. Yet as he lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his cell, the old man knew the truth. Digging deeper into David's lies would not be without consequences. The next letter from Michael came only a week later, and it made Robert's hands tremble as he read. The boy wrote with the excitement of someone chasing pieces of a puzzle, but also with the sharp instinct of a teenager who sensed danger. Michael had pressed his father with questions about the suitcase, about the old plane ticket. At first, David tried to dismiss it all. But when Michael pushed harder, his father's calm veneer cracked. He grew agitated, pacing the living room, telling Michael to stop meddling in things that don't concern him. That confrontation only fueled Michael's determination. He returned to the old neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking questions. Neighbors remembered Robert not as a criminal, but as a man who worked double shifts, a man who laid bricks on weekends to finish his own home. Their stories didn't sound like the life of a thief. They sounded like the life of a man betrayed. Then came the surprise that shook Robert the most. In his letter, Michael revealed that he had stumbled on an old shoebox tucked in the back of his father's closet. Inside were faded photographs, receipts, and scattered documents. One stood out. Bank statements from the months before Robert's arrest. Large deposits, far more than David's salary, flowing in and out of an account in his father's name. Robert sat at the edge of his bunk, heart pounding. These weren't rumors, they were facts. Paper trails that could not be brushed aside as confused memories or misunderstandings. His grandson was uncovering the very proof he had prayed someone would find. But Michael didn't stop there. The boy wrote that he had tried to track down Richard Lawson, the company's former accountant. His father insisted Lawson had died years ago, but Mrs. Carter believed otherwise. Rumors placed him in a small town in Pennsylvania, living quietly with failing health. Michael wanted to find him. Robert folded the letter carefully and closed his eyes. Pride swelled in his chest. Michael was only 15, but he carried himself with the determination of a man twice his age, yet pride mixed with dread. If David discovered how much his son had unearthed, there was no telling how he might react. That fear proved well-founded. In the following week's letter, Michael described how his father had grown paranoid, selling off family belongings, snapping at every question and locking his study door. "He's hiding something, Grandpa," Michael wrote. "I can feel it. Every time I ask about the past, he changes the subject. And the more I push, the angrier he gets." Robert read those words slowly, each sentence weighing heavier than the last he knew. That look in David's eyes, the one Michael now described. It was the same look Robert had seen on the day of the trial, a mix of fear and defiance, the expression of a man trapped by his own lies. But then came the twist Robert hadn't expected. Michael ended his letter with a confession. "I'm not doing this alone, Grandpa. I've already spoken to attorney Charles Bennett." Robert nearly dropped the page. He hadn't wanted Michael so close to the legal fight, but the boy had taken matters into his own hands. He'd gone to Bennett, shared what he had found, and even handed over copies of the bank statements. For Robert, it was both a relief and a worry. Relief, because the evidence was finally in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Worry, because if David caught wind of this alliance, Michael could be in real danger. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He imagined his grandson, alone with those secrets, standing up to a father who had once betrayed his own flesh and blood for money. He thought of the shoebox, the bank statements, the trembling in David's voice when Michael pressed him too far. And in that silence, Robert realized something. The truth was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about protecting Michael. Ensuring that the next generation did not carry the scars of his son's betrayal, he picked up a pen and began. Another letter, not of despair this time, but of guidance. "Michael," he wrote, "you are braver than I ever imagined. But bravery needs wisdom beside it. Keep your documents safe. Share only with Bennett and Mrs. Carter. And above all, be careful. Your father may not stop at words if he feels trapped." Robert sealed the letter with a trembling hand. For the first time in years, he was no longer writing from a place of hopelessness. He was writing as a grandfather one, determined to protect the boy who had unknowingly become the torchbearer of truth, not long after Michael placed the bank statements into attorney Charles Bennett's hands. A new door cracked open in Robert Miller's long, dark tunnel. Bennett, thorough as ever, had tracked down a name from the past: Richard Lawson. The company accountant from 25 years ago. Lawson was no longer the sharp, suit-wearing man Robert remembered. Time had carved deep lines into his face, and sickness had hollowed him out. But his eyes, they still carried the weight of numbers, of balance sheets that never added up. When Bennett sat across from Robert in the prison visiting room, his voice carried a seriousness Robert hadn't heard before. "I found Lawson," he said quietly. "He's alive, but barely. Doesn't want to die with secrets on his conscience." Robert leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. After so many years of silence, the thought of Lawson speaking up was almost too much to believe. Bennett continued. "He admitted what you always suspected. David wasn't just reckless. He was stealing in small amounts long before the big embezzlement. Lawson saw the irregularities, but fear kept him quiet. And here's the part you never knew. Your son didn't act alone. He had help inside the company." The words settled like stones in Robert's chest. "Help?" he whispered. Bennett nodded. Grimly. "Thomas Whitman, the owner's son. He and David worked together to siphon money, covering each other's tracks. Lawson has documents to prove it: fake invoices, doctored ledgers, even old emails." For Robert, the revelation was like a sudden crack of thunder. All these years he had carried the belief that his son had acted out of greed and fear alone. Now he understood. David had been a pawn in a larger game, guided by someone with power and influence. It explained why the trial had been so swift, why no one wanted to listen to his defense. With Thomas Whitman's family name at stake, they needed a scapegoat, and Robert had been the perfect choice. But alongside the anger came a sliver of something Robert hadn't felt in decades. Hope. If Lawson was willing to testify, if the documents still existed, then perhaps his story was no longer just an old man's word against his son's. Perhaps this time, the evidence would speak for itself. Michael's next letter only deepened that hope. The boy wrote that he had spoken with Lawson himself. Grandpa Michael's neat handwriting said, "He looked so frail. But when he talked about what happened, it was like he became 20 years younger. He said he should have come forward long ago. He said you didn't deserve what happened." Robert pressed the letter against his chest. To hear those words after a lifetime of silence, it was like breathing fresh air after drowning. Yet, with every step forward, danger lurked closer. Bennett warned Robert that Whitman still held influence. "Men like him don't fade quietly," the lawyer said. "If he senses his past is catching up, he may try to shut Lawson down before the truth sees daylight." That fear proved justified when Michael wrote again days later. "Dad's been restless. He's been making phone calls at odd hours. I overheard him mention Mr. Whitman. He sounded desperate, almost scared." Robert closed his eyes, the truth sinking deeper. His son wasn't just guilty, he was trapped, tied to Whitman's power, chained by debts and secrets. And Michael, young and unafraid, was walking straight into the middle of it all. Late that night, in the dim glow of his cell light, Robert put pen to paper. His letter to Michael was steady but urgent. "Son, be cautious. The truth is powerful, but it is also dangerous. Keep copies of everything you find. Do not confront your father directly. Now remember, you are not alone. Bennett and Lawson are with you. Hold on to that." As he sealed the envelope, Robert's hands shook. Not from fear for himself. His years behind bars had hardened him to that. but from fear of history repeating. He had already lost his wife to heartbreak, already lost his freedom to betrayal. He would not lose his grandson to the same darkness. And so, with Lawson's confession and Whitman's shadow looming larger than ever, Robert understood one thing with painful clarity. The fight for justice had outgrown his own story. It was now a battle for Michael's future, too. It wasn't long before Robert Miller felt the ripple effect of Lawson's confession. Word traveled fast in small towns, and even faster in circles where power and reputation were at stake. Next visit he received wasn't from his grandson, or even from Attorney Bennett. It was from David, his own son, and a man in a polished suit who introduced himself simply as Mr. Clayton, David's attorney. The guard led them into the visitation room, and for a moment Robert could hardly recognize his son, David's hair, once neat and full, was thinning. His face carried lines not just from age, but from worry. He didn't look like the successful man who had once stood in a courtroom and convinced a judge that his father was guilty. He looked cornered. David didn't waste time. He sat down across from Robert, folded his hands tightly, began with a voice that was meant to sound controlled, but trembled at the edges. "Dad, we need to talk about the future." Robert leaned back slowly, studying his son, letting the silence stretch. After decades of being treated as if he were invisible, he had learned the power of waiting. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but steady. "Whose future, David? Yours or mine?" The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to steer the conversation. "Mr. Miller, what your son means is that these rumors, these stories resurfacing, could cause unnecessary trouble. It would be better for everyone if we put this all behind us. If you agree to stop pursuing it, I can assure you there will be considerations made for your comfort." Robert almost laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. For 25 years, he had eaten cold meals on tin trays, slept on a mattress thin as cardboard, and been called by a number instead of his name. And now they were offering him comfort? He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on David. "I spent a quarter of a century in this place because of you," Robert said quietly, but the words carried weight. "You walked into that courtroom, looked me in the eye, and swore I was guilty. And now you want to bargain with me like I'm still a fool you can control?" David shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand, Dad. Things are complicated. If this case is reopened, it won't just be me who suffers. Whitman has resources, connections. He'll bury us both." The mention of Thomas Whitman confirmed what Robert already knew from Lawson's testimony. David was still tangled in the same web that had ensnared him years ago. For a long moment, Robert didn't respond. He thought of his late wife, who had gone to her grave believing she'd married a thief. He thought of Michael, brave and relentless, risking his own safety to chase the truth. And then he thought of himself, a man who had been silenced for too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but unshakable. "I am not your shield anymore, David. I won't carry your sins so. You can sleep at night. Whatever happens now, happens because of choices you made, not mine." The lawyer leaned forward, his polished confidence slipping just a little. "Mr. Miller, I strongly advise," Robert cut him off with a glance sharp enough to silence. "Him, you advise whoever pays your fees, son. But me, I've already paid. With my life, my marriage, my freedom, I will not pay again." For the first time, David's composure cracked. His eyes flickered, and beneath the anger, Robert saw something else: fear. Not of prison bars, but of exposure, the mask of control he had worn for years was slipping, and Robert knew it. The guard tapped his watch, signaling the visit was nearly over. Robert stood first, surprising them both. He placed his weathered hands on the table and looked directly at his son. "You came here to warn me. Consider your warning given. But listen carefully. David, I am not the one you need to fear. It's the truth. And sooner or later, it has a way of finding daylight." He turned and walked back toward the steel door, his steps steady, his back straight. For once, he wasn't leaving the room defeated. He was leaving on his own terms. That night, lying on his bunk, Robert replayed the conversation in his mind. For years he had dreamed of confronting his son, of demanding answers. But when the moment finally came, he didn't need to shout or beg. He only needed to stand firm. And in that quiet strength, Robert felt something he hadn't in decades. Sense of control, of dignity. It was a turning point. Whatever came next, Robert knew this much. He would no longer be treated as a pawn in someone else's game. The truth was moving forward, and he was no longer powerless to stop it. A week after the tense meeting with David and his lawyer, Robert Miller received an envelope slid under the bars of his cell. It was heavier than the usual letters from Michael, and the guard's knowing glance told him it carried weight beyond paper. Robert opened it with steady hands. Though his heart pounded like it hadn't in years, inside were official documents stamped, notarized, and unmistakable. They confirmed something he had long suspected but never dared hope. His wife, for her passing, had quietly secured assets in his name. Among them was a small villa in Maine, a modest two-story home on the edge of a quiet harbor town. It had been kept separate from the life David controlled, tucked away as if she had known he might one day need a refuge. Robert sat back on the thin mattress, the papers trembling in his hands. For so long, he had lived stripped of dignity, with nothing to his name but a prison number. Now here it was, in black and white proof that he still had something that belonged to him, something no one could take away. The discovery stirred something inside him he thought was gone. He began to plan, not grand, impossible plans, but small, deliberate steps. He made lists in his mind. What would go with him? What he would leave behind? What he would rebuild when freedom finally came? His first act of quiet defiance was symbolic. Using the little money he earned from working in the prison workshop, Robert arranged to send back every personal item of David's that had lingered in his storage box for decades-old photographs, letters, even a watch Robert had once given him for his high school graduation. Each item was carefully packed and labeled with a note in Robert's clear, steady handwriting. Returning what belongs to you. Keeping what belongs to me. When David received the box weeks later, his reaction was predictable. He stormed into the prison visitation room, red-faced, demanding to know what his father thought he was doing. Robert simply sat there, calm and unshaken, and replied, drawing the line, "Son, I will not carry your things anymore. Not your guilt, not your lies, and not your belongings." For the first time in years, Robert saw his son's anger burn out in front of him. David had always expected him to stay quiet, to endure, to absorb the blows in silence. But this small act of reclaiming himself rattled David more than any accusation could. That night, Robert lay on his bunk with the villa documents folded neatly under his pillow. He thought of his wife, her foresight, her quiet strength, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to dream. He pictured walking along a rocky Maine shoreline, the air sharp with salt, his grandson beside him, not as a prisoner, not as a broken man, but as a grandfather with stories to tell, lessons to share. And finally a place that was his again. Michael's next letter only deepened that hope. The boy wrote of his own preparations, sorting through more of David's boxes, organizing evidence, and keeping copies safe in case anything went missing. Robert smiled as he read, recognizing the determination of a teenager who refused to be silenced. Yet beneath the pride was a gnawing worry. He knew the closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous the game would become. Still, Robert's resolve only grew. He had spent 25 years being told what he was not innocent, not worthy, not free. But with every new step, Lawson's confession, Mrs. Carter's memory, Michael's discoveries, and now the villa, he felt the tide turning. He was not just waiting for justice anymore. He was preparing for the life that waited beyond the prison gates. And so, in the quiet of his cell, Robert whispered to himself a promise he had never dared make before. When those doors open, I'll be ready. The box Robert had returned to David, filled with old keepsakes and accompanied by that short, deliberate note, was more than just a gesture. It was a line drawn in the sand. For the first time, Robert had pushed something back onto his son, forcing David to carry the weight of his own past. The response came quickly. Only a few days later, Robert was summoned to the visitation room again. When the guard opened the door, he didn't see the polished lawyer this time. It was David alone, pacing like a caged animal before slamming his hands down on the metal table. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David's voice cracked with fury. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, his composure slipping. Robert moved slowly, lowering himself into the chair without saying a word. His silence only stoked David's anger. "You're selfish," David spat. "Do you know what kind of mess you've stirred up? Sending me that box, making Michael doubt me, dragging the past into the present. Why can't you just let it die?" Robert finally met his son's eyes, steady and unflinching. For years he had rehearsed what he might say if this moment ever came. But now, standing at the edge of it, he realized he didn't need prepared speeches. He only needed the truth, because the past never died. "David," Robert said softly, but with the kind of weight that filled the room. "It's been alive every single day of these 25 years, every time I woke up behind these bars. Every night I tried to sleep with my wife's memory, believing I was a thief. You don't bury something like that by pretending it never happened." David shook his head violently. "You don't understand. I was just trying to survive. I did what I had to do. And you," his voice broke into a bitter laugh, "you were supposed to take it. You always took it. Every sacrifice, every burden. Why not this one too?" For a moment, Robert felt a pang of something like sorrow. The boy he had once raised to believe in hard work and honor had twisted those lessons into an excuse for betrayal. But that sorrow quickly hardened into resolve. "No," Robert said, his voice cutting clean through the air. "Not this time. I am not your shield anymore. I carried enough of your weight to break a dozen men. You'll carry your own now." The silence that followed was sharp enough to hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. David leaned across the table, his eyes blazing. "You think Michael's going to save you? It's just a kid. He doesn't know how the world works. And when this all comes crashing down, he'll hate you for it." Robert didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Maybe he will. Or maybe he'll see that standing up for the truth is worth more than protecting a lie. Either way, he'll learn something you never did. A man's worth isn't in what he takes. It's in what he stands for." The guard stepped into the doorway, sensing the heat of the exchange. David straightened his jacket, trying to mask his trembling hands, but his eyes betrayed him. He was rattled, not because of what his father said, but because for the first time he realized he no longer held control. As Robert rose to leave, he turned back just once. "You came here looking for me to bend, David, but you're looking at a man who's already been bent as far as he can go, and I didn't break." The guard escorted Robert out, the steel door clanging shut between father and son. That night in his cell, Robert lay awake, not with anger, but with clarity. For years, David's betrayal had defined him. It had stripped him of freedom, of family, of peace. But in that moment at the visitation table, Robert had taken something back. Not revenge, not even justice, but dignity. And dignity, he realized, was the one thing David could never steal again. The days after that stormy confrontation brought Robert a strange kind of calm. For years he had lived under the shadow of his son's power. But now, with each step Michael took on the outside, that shadow grew smaller. It started with another letter written in Michael's careful hand. The boy described how he had spent weekends sorting through the attic boxes David had long ignored. Old papers, receipts, photographs all tossed together without care. What David saw as clutter, Michael saw as a trail. And slowly, that trail began to tell a story. He found letters between David and Thomas Whitman, written in the late 90s, filled with coded language about adjustments and covering losses. He uncovered a ledger showing irregular payments to Shell, accounts amounts too large to explain away as accounting errors. Most shocking of all, tucked inside a worn manila envelope, was a deed transfer for Robert's old house. It showed how David had sold the very home his father had built. Pocketing the money for himself, Michael described how he laid the documents out across his bedroom floor, piecing them together like a puzzle. The picture was undeniable. Fraud. Conspiracy and betrayal layered thicker than anyone had dared admit. When Robert read the words, a heaviness pressed against his chest. The home he had poured 20 years of sweat into gone, traded away without dignity, like it had never mattered. For a long time, he just stared at the wall of his cell, imagining the porch where he used to drink coffee with his wife. The garden she loved so much, sold, lost. Another theft David had committed, not just of money, but of memory, yet mixed. With grief was something else. Gratitude, because Michael, his grandson he hadn't known existed until months ago, was standing in the ruins of the past and salvaging the truth piece by piece. The letter ended with a promise, Grandpa, not letting any of this stay hidden. I'll put it all in order, and when the time comes, we'll have enough to prove everything. Robert folded the letter carefully, his fingers tracing the words as if they could carry him outside these walls. Then quietly he took out his own small notebook, the one he used to keep his thoughts organized. He drew 3 columns across the page, what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. It was a simple system, but it gave him clarity. On one side were the lies David had built. On the other, the truths Lawson, Mrs. Carter, and now Michael were bringing to light. And in the middle was the delicate balance of appearances keeping, David convinced he still had the upper hand. While the real story gathered strength in the shadows, that night Robert felt something he hadn't in decades. Control. Not of his circumstances, but of his choices. Then came another turn he hadn't expected. A guard slipped a thin envelope under his door documents, forwarded from Attorney Bennett. They were Lisbon court papers, confirming that the small villa his late wife had secured years ago was legally his. The property had been untouched, waiting quietly for the day he could claim it. Robert held the papers like a lifeline. For so long, his identity had been stripped down to numbers on a prison uniform. Now, here was proof that he still had a place in the world. Not just as a man wrongly accused, but as a man who could build again. When David visited next, furious over Michael's digging, Robert met him at the steel table with steady eyes. His son raged, called him selfish, accused him of destroying what little was left of the family name. But Robert stayed calm, letting the storm pass. Finally, when the words ran dry, he simply said, I'm not your resource to manage. David, I'm not your shield, and I'm not your excuse. I'm a man with a life of his own, and you can't take that from me anymore. The silence after was thicker than any argument. For the first time, David had nothing left to throw. Back in his cell, Robert slid the villa papers under his pillow. He thought of Michael, hunched over those attic boxes, fighting for a truth bigger than himself. He thought of his wife, who had prepared this last gift without ever telling him. And he thought of the moment he would one day step outside these walls, not as an old man broken by prison, but as someone who had endured, who had kept his dignity intact. The past was full of loss, yes, but for the first time the future felt within reach. The weeks after Robert's quiet standoff with his son carried a strange stillness, like the air before a storm. Michael continued sending letters filled with new discoveries. Attorney Bennett pressed ahead with filings, and whispers about re-examining Robert's case grew louder. Still, Robert kept his heart guarded. He'd been let down too many times before to put his trust in rumors of hope then. One morning, the guard called his number and led him into the same small room where he had once faced David's fury. But this time, the man who entered didn't stride in with arrogance. David came slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, the weight of years of lies finally dragging him down. For a long moment, father and son just stared at each other. Robert saw a man aged beyond his years' clothes, disheveled, hands trembling, the mask of control shattered. And David saw his father, still standing tall, despite prison's toll, steady in a way he himself had never managed. When David finally spoke, his voice cracked. Dad, I can't carry it anymore. Robert didn't answer right away. He had waited 25 years for those words, but they didn't bring satisfaction. They brought sorrow for what could have been avoided, for the years stolen. David continued, words tumbling out like water from a broken dam. He spoke of his debts, the gamblers he had owed, the threats that had cornered him. He admitted how Thomas Whitman had offered him a way out, promising money and protection if only Robert became the scapegoat. "I let him convince me," David said, tears streaking down his face. "I planted the money. I signed your name. I let Mom go to her grave thinking you were a thief." Robert closed his eyes at that. The pain was almost too much to bear. His wife, the woman who had stood beside him through lean years, had died without knowing the truth. That wound would never fully heal. Yet when Robert opened his eyes, his voice was steady. "So now you finally admit it." David nodded, unable to meet his father's gaze. "I'll testify. I'll tell the judge everything. Just want Michael to grow up thinking I was nothing but a coward?" The words hung in the air. Robert, it was not absolution, but it was something. A first step, however late, toward the truth that had been buried for so long. In the weeks that followed, the case moved faster than Robert dared hope. Ellison's sworn statement was filed. Mrs. Carter repeated her testimony about the suitcase. Michael's documents were copied, cataloged, and added to the growing mountain of evidence. And then, the final blow, David took the stand and confessed under oath, confirming what Robert had claimed from the very beginning. The courtroom, packed with reporters and townsfolk who once believed Robert guilty, fell into stunned silence. As David described how Whitman had orchestrated the scheme, how he had played along to save his own skin, and how his father had paid the price. Judge Harper listened carefully and leaned forward, his gavel resting quietly in his hand. "Mr. Miller," he said, turning toward Robert, "what you have endured is nothing short of a tragedy of justice. On the basis of new testimony, forensic evidence, and corroborating witnesses, this court overturns your conviction." Sat motionless. For a moment, he thought he hadn't heard correctly. Overturned. After 25 years of being a number in a jumpsuit, he was once again Robert Miller. But then the judge added something Robert hadn't expected. "However, due to the age of the case, your release will require final approval from the governor's office. It may take weeks, perhaps months." The room blurred for a moment. Freedom was within reach, but still just out of hand. It was a bitter irony, declared innocent, yet still behind bars. That night, back in his cell, Robert lay awake with the echo of the gavel in his ears. He thought of Michael, who had carried the torch of truth further than any grown man had. He thought of his wife, who never lived to see his name cleared. And he thought of David, broken by his own choices, yet finally brave enough to admit them. The road ahead was not finished. But for the first time in a quarter of a century, Robert felt something he had nearly lost forever. Hope not as a fragile wish, but as a living force. Steady and real. The days after the judge's ruling felt unreal to Robert Miller. He had been declared innocent, yet he still woke each morning to the clang of steel doors. Freedom was promised, but trapped in red tape, for a man who had counted the years by scratches on a wall, every extra week felt like another injustice. But then came the visit that lifted his spirit higher than any legal paper could. That Saturday morning, into the visitation room, expecting another routine talk with his lawyer. Instead, it was Michael who walked through the door, his eyes bright, carrying a quiet excitement he could barely contain. "Grandpa," said, rushing forward with the energy of youth, "the governor's signature is coming next week. You'll be out of here for good." Robert froze. After 25 years of waiting, those words hit harder than any prison gate slamming shut. He pulled his grandson into a hug, holding on longer than he meant to. "Next week," he whispered, his voice breaking. "After all this time?" But Michael wasn't finished. He leaned in, lowering his voice like he was letting his grandfather in on a secret. "There's something else. Mrs. Carter and we've been working on a surprise. We bought back the old house." Robert's breath caught. He shook his head in disbelief. "That house was sold years ago. David burned it all away." Michael smiled, his grin wide with determination. "The money Whitman had to return it didn't just go to the courts. Bennett helped us use it. We tracked down the deed, the house. Isn't exactly the same, but we're restoring it. Room by room, using old photos. Mrs. Carter remembered the layout. The porch you built, even the window boxes Grandma loved. It's coming back, Grandpa, and there's a room waiting for you." Robert felt the tears rise before he could stop them. The house had been more than wood, and brick was 20 years of sweat, sacrifice, and love. To know it was being rebuilt. Not as a monument to the past, but as a promise for the future. It was almost more than his heart could carry. He looked at Michael, his jaw tightening with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Michael reached across the table, gripping his grandfather's hands. "I do, Grandpa. Because it means the world to me, too. You won't just be free, you'll be home. We'll live together. Me and even Dad, when he's done paying his dues, will finally be a family." The word struck Robert deep. Family. For years, that word had been poisoned by betrayal. Yet here was his grandson, young but wise, speaking of forgiveness, of rebuilding not just walls, but bonds. Robert didn't know if he could ever fully forgive David, but Michael's hope was contagious. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about choosing not to let it destroy the future as the visit ended. Robert walked back to his cell with lighter steps than he had carried in decades. For the first time, he wasn't just dreaming of freedom. He could see it, taste it, almost reach out and touch it. A home waiting. A grandson ready to walk beside him. A chance, however late, to reclaim what had been stolen. And in that moment, Robert realized something that would stay with him forever. Sometimes life strips us of everything: freedom, reputation, even family. But if we hold on, if we keep our dignity intact, the truth has a way of resurfacing. Justice may come late, but when it does, it carries with it a chance to rebuild. Not just houses, but hearts. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you find it in your heart to forgive someone who betrayed you? Shh. Your feelings in the comments below. And if you want more stories of resilience, justice, and second chances, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the hardest journeys lead us home.